Hello, and welcome to today's event, brought to you by the Recount and Future Forum. I'm John Battelle, co-founder and CEO of the Recount, and I'm excited to host today's event, How Will the Future Work? We're going to be digging into the trends driving major shifts in how work works. How are managers, employees, and technology reshaping the practice and the culture of work? We have a seasoned and deeply experienced panel of experts and executives here to help your company adapt to a digital-first workplace. So there's a lot of buzz and buzzwords around all of this. There's work from home, hybrid work, flexible work, the 4-day work week, work from anywhere. But what does all of that really mean? And how do you create a workplace that works for you and your employees in a world that's been reshaped by technology, by a new generation of employees who may have different ideas about work, and of course, a 2+ year pandemic, which still hasn't stopped. As a matter of fact, we have people here in the audience. I don't know if you can go to a shot of our wonderful studio audience. This is a hybrid event, and I got about 3 or 4 emails just this afternoon of people who couldn't make it because they or their family have COVID. So we are still in the midst of this. And of course, that pandemic accelerated trends that have been hitting us for the last 20 years. We'll get into all of that, but first, for those of you who don't know anything about the Recount, here's your chance to learn a little bit about it. We cover the corridors of power on the platforms that are reshaping the news. That's social and streaming platforms. And we do it as journalists do it. You might know us from our coverage of politics. When we started, there was a very important presidential election that was building, but we have expanded recently to culture, technology, and business. Of course, this is part of our business coverage right here. We promise that we will never waste your time. We reject the tired tropes. We focus on the core values of journalism, which is to uncover the truth and hold that truth to power and reflect the world as it is today, not as many of us wish it would be. Now, on to a little bit of housekeeping. You can submit questions from the live stream in the chat. We are across LinkedIn, where I think most of you are right now, but also Twitter and YouTube, so you can hit us there. And if you're watching this live stream later, please just at us and we'll respond to you anytime. Some of you have submitted questions in advance. We'll try to get to all of them. Thank you for that. Of course, those of you in the audience, we have a mic for you, so you'll be able to ask questions in real time. So now, on to the program. We are very excited to partner with Future Forum for today's event. Future Forum is a consortium that helps companies make the transformations necessary to thrive in this new economy. Slack was a founding partner and member of Future Forum, and I have to say, just as an aside, we here at the Recount invested heavily in building on top of Slack just before the pandemic. There were 35 of us in an office all together every single day. One day we were there, the next day we were not. And because we invested in Slack, we did not miss a beat. As a matter of fact, we did not miss a day of coverage. Everyone went into their apartments because we had integrated with Slack as kind of our digital HQ. Boom, we could keep working that way, and it's been that way pretty much ever since. If you saw the wide shot, you'll see that we're here in a big office. We have 40, 45 people, and at any given day, 15 or 20% of them are here, but we're still cranking it out and having a lot of fun doing it. So, on to the program. We'll be joined by 2 Future Forum executives soon, and they're also newly minted best-selling authors. And we'll dive into what they find about the future of work. But let's first start with someone who's kind of an OG in the space, and who better than Professor Raj Choudhury. I'm hoping I said that correctly. The Lumry Family Associate Professor at Harvard Business School. His research is focused on studying the future of work, especially the geography of work. He studies the productivity effects of geographic mobility of workers, the causes of geographic immobility, and productivity effects of remote work practices, such as work from anywhere or all remote. His research has been published in far too many outlets to mention. He earned his doctorate from Harvard and has degrees from the Indian Institute of Technology and the Indian Institute of Management. prior to joining academia about a decade ago, I believe. He worked at McKinsey, at Microsoft, and at IBM, so he's lived inside and outside the halls of work, and who better to kick us off? So welcome, Raj.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. You've been studying these new modes. I mean, first of all, here you are in person. Thank you for coming. You are very much in demand because when the pandemic hit, everyone was trying to figure out what does this all mean? And here's somebody who's been studying this for over a decade. What have you learned about new approaches to work, in particular as it relates to, how managers might implement new structures post-pandemic?
Sure. So my research, as you said, dates back for a decade. And the work I did prior to the pandemic was mostly focused on work from anywhere, where the worker gets to choose where to live. And that work, of all places, started in the US Patent Office.
The Patent Office.
Correct. And trust me, they were way ahead of times. So they implemented a work from home regime in 2007, and they transitioned to work from anywhere in 2012, where the patent examiners now left Alexandria, Virginia, and spread all over the country. And in that study, I found that work from anywhere led to about a 4.4% increase in productivity. But currently, we are in the world of hybrid. I think that's the buzzword of the moment. And we have a lot of feelings around hybrid, but very little scientific evidence. So what we are trying to do is run experiments. And so one of the experiments that we ran, I think it's probably one of the first experiments on hybrid work, shows that the optimum number of work days when a worker needs to be co-located with the team is around 25% of the work days. So this is a randomized controlled trial where we randomized every day who gets to work from the office versus works remotely. And we find that the folks in that 25%, it's actually 23 to 40% category, they do better on almost every single outcome we've looked at.
Interesting.
So that's the emerging sort of.
Now, is that 25% of the entire staff at the same time, or is it team-based, or how do you?
So it's 25% work days in the office co-located with team members.
With team members, okay.
Correct. But the thing is that 25% doesn't need to be every week. So one of the examples that I like to talk about is this tech company TCS, Tata Consulting Services. So they have a model around this 25% number. But they decide they give the autonomy to every team to decide when the team comes together.
Right.
So some teams come together one day a week. Some teams come together one entire week every month. And some other teams, because they are far flung and they're distributed, just come in once a quarter, but stay longer for several days together.
Right.
So I think that is the emerging scientific evidence of the best practice of organizing hybrid work.
You've also, as a matter of fact, when we spoke earlier, you said you've published sort of 10 management principles. So this is a very new structure. It's almost as if you had the building that contained the management structures. It's like, well, we've got a building, so you've got to come into it every day. Now I don't have to think about anything else because you're all here. But how do you manage this as, if you're a leader of a team or a leader of a company? How would you, what are the principles of managing it now that you don't have the building doing it for you? Sure. What are some of those principles that you've discovered?
Yeah, and you don't need a building. So just on the 25% time, I think of it as we can work from anywhere for a vast majority of our work days. So what we are really doing during that 25% co-location is we are doing a very deep social bonding with the team. We are establishing trust. We are mentoring each other. We are collaborating at a very deep level. But the most important thing is we are building a common sort of set of principles and trust among each other so that once we disperse, John and I got to know each other really well. Now we are living far away, but if I call John, he's going to help me. So it's all about that deep social connection. But beyond that, I've written about all these other management practices that CEOs and CHROs need to think about. So how do we mentor? How do we onboard? How do we codify knowledge? How do we socialize both in person and virtually? How do we think about wellness? And I think all of this is, in my opinion, an organizational transformation.
Yeah.
So what really this transition to hybrid or work from anywhere is less of a technology change. It's an organizational transformation with new habits, and new business policies that need to be implemented at the top and then seep down below.
So can you just unpack one or two of those? Like, I mean, for me, onboarding, we've hired half the team. I mean, we're a new company.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we were 6 months old when the pandemic hit. And so half the team, more than half the team, until very recently, had never been together in an office.
Yeah.
What did we do wrong?
So I don't know about you guys.
Like,
but
how did we onboard? I'm sure we did everything wrong. Like,
I can tell you like a couple of best practices that immediately come to mind. So one of the all remote companies I've studied very closely. So there are many now. And so these all remote companies don't have any offices. And they existed before the pandemic, and they're
Right.
growing in number. So this is a company called Zapier. And what they do is they have this mentorship policy where every new employee gets a Zap pal. So it's a partner who's not a team member, who's definitely not a manager, and is a safe
well, you said that like it's a bad thing.
No. And you'll understand in a minute why, because this is a person you can ask any question. And so that's one thing they did. GitLab, which is a different all-remote company I've studied, what they have done really well is they have codified all the answers to any question that starts with the word how. So how do we file an expense report here? How do I get promoted? How do I get a salary raise? How do I talk to the media and get approval for that? All those questions are documented in the GitLab handbook, which is constantly updated so that any new person can just like join and read up on everything that's important to know here.
Right.
So I think there are many such practices that I've talked about and written about, but those are two that immediately come to mind.
Yeah. We have one of those how manuals. Shout out to Felicia and Deej out there, because they crushed it on that one. So it makes me feel good, like we got something right.
Sure.
What mistakes or bad habits have you noticed as you study this that managers or companies make?
So that's interesting. So two things immediately come to mind. So I think the first thing is not realizing that this is a new way of working truly, that you need to think about these 10 organizational practices or processes. You cannot take the manual from the back-end office days to the virtual world or the hybrid world, and you can't do this piecemeal. You can't pick and choose. You have to do all of it. You have to change how you onboard, how you codify knowledge, how you measure productivity, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
And the other big mistake that I've noticed is, you can talk about it, but not change yourself. And especially if you're a really senior manager, your sort of demeanor is really shaping the behavior of middle managers.
Right.
And so you have to be demonstrative of this new principle.
Yes.
And this new way of working.
Yeah. We're going to get into some of that when we talk to the next guests. When we spoke earlier, we only have about 5 minutes left, but I hope we can unpack this question, because it was a fascinating thing that you've studied at a plant in Unilever, a pilot program, I believe.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of a geek when it comes to things like manufacturing and supply chain, but this particular example that you told me about is so fascinating in that it really peels back the layers of what it means to be truly work from anywhere. So can you tell us about that study and what we've learned from it?
So I guess I have like a couple of minutes. I'll be very brief. So I think the concern that I've heard for many years now is that work from anywhere and hybrid belongs to the tech industry. What about like blue collar jobs, right? So this particular pilot that Unilever ran in Brazil is based on this principle of digital twins, where you create a digital replica of a physical operation. In their case, a manufacturing plant. But you can do the same for an oil rig, for a hospital. And so what they do is they put sensors on the operation. There's a cloud with machine learning analytics, and that tells the human operator what sort of input, in this case, gas.
So the digital twin is almost like the eyes and the ears of someone who otherwise would be in the physical location.
That is correct. So, and the day that Unilever implemented this pilot, the entire factory in Brazil was run from the kitchen table of the control engineer, who erstwhile would be standing next to the operation.
Right.
And now on paper, there are 4 such factories in Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, and the US, and all 4 can be run by a single operator sitting on a beach in Hawaii. So that is pushing the frontiers of work from anywhere.
Yeah, on a beach from Hawaii, running a
Or
manufacturing
choose your
plant.
favorite, yeah. So that's pushing the frontiers of work from anywhere into blue collar and manufacturing.
Yes, I mean, and not only beyond sort of just the tech companies like, you know, Zapier or GitHub, but we're talking about a major consumer packaged goods company.
That's right.
And a manufacturer and blue collar. I mean, there's so many layers to how.
Absolutely.
I mean, we tend to think that, you know, work from home is kind of limited to people who are on computers and are used to being on computers, but this is a whole nother level. I think it's really fascinating. Okay, in the last couple of minutes, I've got another question around, you mentioned this, particularly senior managers having to, you know, sort of model the behavior, but there's a lot of pushback. I mean, there's been 2 years of press and coverage of is this right? Are people coming back? We've seen major corporations declare everyone must come back to the office. There's a lot of pushback to all of this. Why do you think that is?
So I'll give you a quick reaction to that and tell you, you know, my feelings on this particular problem. So it's a combination of different things, John, and your guess is as good as mine. It's a combination of, you know, old habits not dying easily. Mm-hmm. It's a combination of ego, maybe investment in real estate. But here's the bottom line. I think the bottom line is this will be played out in the market, and companies and CEOs that do not realize and get ahead of the phenomena are just going to lose some of their best employees, and then they'll be forced to adapt. So the market, the demand and supply for talent will essentially play this out.
Yeah, yeah. So with that pushback, you said ego. I find that interesting. You know, I think particularly senior managers like to believe that everything they're doing is according to the best business practice. But do you think it's like, well, this is the way things have always been done, so it must be right?
So, you know, there's a literature, so I'm an academic, so there's a literature on charismatic leaders and how they like to talk to an audience like this, right? Yeah. And one thing that, you know, a technology company I've worked with has done really well is effectively taught, you know, they brought actors in to teach the senior managers how to be effective on camera. And now they're charismatic, and they're being charismatic not in person, right, but on camera. Right. So you just change the paradigm and embrace the new paradigm.
Interesting. Well, I wish we could talk for another half an hour, but unfortunately, we're at time. You can follow Raj on Twitter. I think that's your preferred place to, sure. And we will drop a link to your handle in the chat. Thank you so much, Professor Choudhury. Really appreciate it.
Thanks again. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, moving right along, how can you, as a company, take all of these findings and apply them to your workplace? Future Forum, which the aforementioned Future Forum is a consortium that was launched by Slack. It surveyed over 10,000 knowledge workers and turned those findings into a book, which I have read. And two of the book's co-authors are here with us today to help you and your company understand how to take the necessary steps to achieve a digital-first workplace. There are 7 of them in the book. We are not going to go over all of them, but we are going to have a conversation with these two fine folks. First, Sheela Subramanian. I'm very good at these names, aren't I? Is Vice President and co-founder of Future Forum. She holds 20 years of experience building high-growth organizations and teams across Google, Slack, and other startups. As a champion for workplace equity, her work has been cited in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and other publications. She earned her BA from Stanford and her MBA from Harvard Business School, and is the mother of 2 magical daughters, which actually we'll get into, because knowing something about the personal life of the people you work with is pretty crucial, and it's something you might lose if you're not in an office. Also joining us is Brian Elliott, the executive leader of Future Forum. He has spent 3 decades leading teams and building companies as a startup CEO, as a product leader at Google, and now as a senior vice president at Slack. He started his career at Boston Consulting Group, earned his MBA, I'm sensing a trend here, also from Harvard Business School. And his work has been published in HBR, Fortune, and The Economist, and he is the proud father of 2 young men. Yes. Now, I have 2 daughters and 1 young man, all of them out of the office. That is hilarious that he just said that. Because you think about it, that has been my office for the last 2.5 years, out of the home as of 2 weeks ago. So I am a new empty nester. I'm assuming if you say two young men, you're either there or close to there.
Very close.
Very close. Well, congratulations. Together, our guests with their co-author Helen Cupp are the authors of this book, How the Future Works, Leading Flexible Teams to Do the Best Work of Their Lives. As I said, I've read it and I learned a lot from it. As a matter of fact, I was a bit ashamed of myself after reading it. I'm like, okay, I'm doing these things wrong. I'm going to have to correct this. And we're going to get into some of that right now. So first of all, congratulations. I checked. I'm like your proxy, obsessive author. I had a book out and I was on Amazon every day refreshing. Yep. First of all, am I above 4 stars? Because that's really important. You're well above that. And secondly, where am I in the bestseller lists? And you guys were number 2 last week in the business category, which is really hard to do. So congratulations. But first of all, I know I did a brief thing on Future Forum, but can you tell us what its mission is?
Yes, you did a great intro. Future Forum is a consortium that's backed by Slack, focused on building a future of work that's flexible, inclusive, and connected. So early in the pandemic, we saw organizations do the lift and shift. They lifted their office-based practices and they shifted them into people's living rooms.
Right.
And we saw this as an opportunity to redesign how work has been done from the ground up.
Right.
So we partnered with amazing companies like Boston Consulting Group, Miller Knoll, as well as Management Leadership for Tomorrow, to help build our overall perspective on how work can be better for all types of people,
right, rather
than the select few. And you're going to hear a lot about our research today. We publish a quarterly Future Forum Pulse. We also host executive working groups. Raj was our guest just a few months ago. And overall, our aim is to make work better. Yeah. And that's been a really fulfilling mission over the last few years.
Yeah, yeah. You want to add to that, Brian?
Yeah, and part of what we do, besides the Pulse, which is a quarterly instrument that we've used to actually understand habits and practices, what's working and what's not, and importantly for whom, because the pandemic and this shift towards flexible work has disproportionate benefits for historically underrepresented groups. These executives that we've been working with are actually really instrumental, because in the book we get into case studies and stories from companies that aren't just tech companies. It's not just Slack and Dropbox and IBM. It's Genentech, which has people that have to be that are in R&D, that have to be in the lab part of the time to get their jobs done. Right. Royal Bank of Canada, traditional 100-plus-year-old financial services institution. Right. Levi Strauss & Company, which has consumer goods and retail stores and all the rest of it. And so what we really wanted to do is sort of paint the picture of how taking a different approach and really thinking with intention about how you redesign work can work broadly across any industry and any company. Yeah. But it requires all of us to sort of put that conventional wisdom off to the side for a bit. Yeah. And look at what's working today. Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't think of a more timely, moment to do the work you're doing, right? Were you ever concerned, I'm going off script here for a minute, but were you ever concerned like, oh, well, the pandemic's gonna be over and we won't have anything to do anymore. The shifts happen, the lift and shift has happened, everyone's learned their lessons. Or is it that there's just always more to discover as it relates to this?
There's always more to discover. Yeah. We found every month that goes by, every quarter that goes by, it gets deeper and deeper. Early on in this, to be honest, when we first started this, and I was talking to Sheela and Helen about the three of us co-founding Future Forum, and we were having conversations with Stuart Butterfield, who is Slack's founder, co-founder and CEO, about this. We founded this because we found ourselves in the position of a lot of other companies. Slack itself was an extremely office-centric organization.
Oh, I know. I spent a lot of time in your offices in the early days.
Yeah, and less than 3% of our workforce was remote. And what we found ourselves doing as executives was having conversations with other companies, not about the product, but about policies. What was working, what wasn't? How are you handling burnout? What were you thinking in terms of where you're going to shift some of your stances on this? We also we have a fantastic research team and organization. And so we had already put some work out into the field to understand what was working and what was not. And when we first started this, it was a little bit of like, we may be in this 3 months, because remember, everybody.
Yeah, we didn't know.
We might be back in the office in 6 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
2 years later, it's actually forced us all. It's this plastic moment of understanding that we've had to learn and adapt so much, but it's such an accelerant in terms of thinking about how do we create a more level playing field for everybody to succeed on the basis of the outcomes they can deliver, as opposed to industrial age norms of 9 to 5 office-based work.
Right, right.
That's what's been interesting to see too, is the evolution of flexibility in our work over the last 2 years. When we first started this, we thought flexibility is hybrid. It's where you work. but much of the focus of the book is also when you work.
When,
So
yeah.
what we're seeing is that 94% of global knowledge workers want schedule flexibility.
Yeah.
They want the freedom to figure out when works best for them to do a lot of their work. And so that's been really interesting to see, is just how that preference has increased dramatically, and it's actually more important than where you work.
Well, to follow on that when question, I think as a startup person, which is the only thing that I know how to do, I've struggled with the when because there's never a not working. It's an always working. And I would say my family struggled with that, right? At the soccer games and at the, weddings, here I am on my phone, right? And I used to lug a monitor and a computer before there were laptops around on vacations because I wanted to work, that's how old I am. And so, what have you learned about that? How do you create these guardrails that, allow people to, the office created guardrails. I'm out of the office now. I mean, literally out of the office, was a thing. So how do you do that? How do you build those guardrails to allow for, a balance between the rest of your life and work?
Yeah, it's work means something different to everybody based on the type of team you're in.
Right.
And I think in the past, work was the amount of time you spend in the office in meetings. And that was, I'm going to work to sit in meetings, and then I'm going to actually do my real work once I get home, after the kids are in bed, after dinner, etc.
The second shift.
The second shift.
Yeah.
And now there's an opportunity to bring people together during core team work hours. As Future Forum, our core work hours are 9 a.m. Pacific to 1 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And we have Friday to do focused work. But the reason why we have those core team work hours is because what we were seeing was just a high level of burnout where people were in front of Zoom from 9 to 5 every single day. And they were in meetings that were not necessarily necessary.
Yeah.
And so in the book, we talk about a rubric around meetings. Like, is it used to discuss, debate, decide, or develop your people? Then yes, keep it. If not, bring it into your digital channels, bring it into Slack.
Right.
So we've become increasingly reliant as corporate culture on meetings as a way to show that you're working.
Yes.
And there's an opportunity to give people that schedule flexibility to do their focused work when works best for them.
Yeah.
So guardrails, team level agreements in terms of how you want to work best together as a team, and also core team work hours have been effective ways to provide that flexibility within a framework that many people want.
Go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
I was going to say there's a leadership element to this that
Yeah.
I've been in your shoes literally. So my wife is the one that helped me understand the term default parent, and I was not one, right? That I blew this early on. I wish I knew then what I've learned over the past couple of years. One of the ongoing discussions that I hear executives debating all the time are things like, I as a leader have always said, just because I send you that note at 10 o'clock in the evening doesn't mean I need you to respond. I'll even say, respond to this in the morning because you know the kind of leader I am, and Sheela has helped me on this tremendously. That doesn't work. As a senior executive, if you're sending that out to your staff at 10 o'clock at night and they see it, they're going to think about it, and their brain's not going to turn off until they get it resolved and responded to.
Right.
And so I've become a big fan of scheduled send, whether it's in Slack or email or whatever else. Just use the scheduled send. If it's not that important, they have to answer it that night. Don't send it that night.
Yes.
So finding ways as leaders for us to exhibit the kind of boundaries that we want people to actually have, and thinking about, even though it's okay with me, is it actually going to be okay with them, or is that going to really blow their own productivity? Is crucially important.
I'm looking at the camera and personally apologizing to the thousands of people who have worked at the 7 companies I started, because I will send Slacks and before Slack emails at every hour of the night and early morning because I wanted to get it off my chest. And that was, and then sometimes I get a 4 a.m. response from somebody, who had their phone lit up and they have to respond. And then I started saying, you don't need to respond now, comma, but blah, 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 blah. But what I've learned from you is, no, that doesn't work either. I figured out schedule send on Slack 2 weeks ago. Okay, 2 weeks ago. Anyway, all right, let's get back to this. In the news, in the past month, actually in last week at Tesla, but before that, Apple, Google, a lot of really big companies that everyone looks up to and says, oh, they've figured this whole thing out. They're the ones that when they issue a policy decree, okay, we're going back to work in January, oops, Omicron, right? Or whatever, the rest of the corporate world kind of follows. But they keep stepping in it, right? They keep kind of messing up. Why do you think that is?
The keywords you already said are policy decree. These are all organizations that are starting off with something that's policy driven. And policies are typically one size fits all, right? So if you're saying to people you need to be in 3 days a week, or even more so, you need to be in 3 days a week, and it's Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, that type of one size fits all approach, no CEO would ever take that with their customers, right? But we're taking it with our employees. We know, and Raj described this earlier, we know that different teams have different rhythms and different habits. We also know that most of those organizations, once you're past a certain size, don't show up on the same floor, let alone in the same building, let alone in the same city.
Right.
So that idea that you have to co-locate in order to build collaboration on that regular frequency of a schedule turns out to be wrong. We've worked with a large number of organizations that are watching this unfold and are saying 3 days a week is actually averaging out to being about 1.5 days a week in terms of what people are actually doing. What do we do about it? And they're taking one of two approaches. They're either getting more stringent, which is not helping their retention at all,
Right.
or they're sitting there going, we need to move from policies to principles. We need to actually think about what are the principles that we want people to apply broadly across the organization around flexibility, around creating a level playing field, around focusing on outcomes, and make that shift. Because if we can espouse the principles we want people to operate under, we're engaging their brains as well. And we're saying, we want you to do this for a purpose, not because we told you so.
Right. Interesting. It made me think of something that you said, Sheela, that this is the thing that really stuck with me. You said, oh gosh, where is it? As a leader, you should really be the last one to come back to the office. Now, when we opened this office here, I was like in at 8 the day it opened, right? Because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. So what did I get wrong?
So Brian talks about principles, and if one of your principles is anchored around flexibility and people having choice, leaders can't be the first ones to show up back in the office. Sorry, John. What we encourage leaders to do
I'm happy to be the guy who screws it all up.
is the last one to be back, because so much of this is modeling the behavior from the top.
Right.
We talked about scheduled send, we talked about core working hours, but it's also if you are telling your employees that it doesn't matter that they come into the office 5 days a week and then you're in the office 5 days a week from 8 to 8, then they're going to follow you and they're going to feel the pressure to be in, and that basically generates presenteeism.
Yes, and that's the second thing that I learned is proximity bias. So can you unpack that?
Yes, so proximity bias is essentially favoritism towards someone who's located nearby, or in this case, in the office. And what we've seen historically, I've received in my performance reviews, is people are lauded for being the first in, the last to leave.
Yep.
The quickest to respond to a message or an email. You care about this company, you're working super hard because you're here all the time.
Right.
And with proximity bias, it's rewarding someone because they're in the office all the time. And the reason why this is troubling is based on our data, what we're seeing is that those who want to be in the office full time, 5 days a week, tend to be men, executives, and white employees. Whereas those who want more flexible work schedules tend to be women, employees of color, as well as caregivers. And we've seen a lot of gains when it comes to flexibility over the last 2 years in terms of providing more equitable and inclusive environments for employees.
Right.
And if you're promoting someone because they're always in the office or you can see that they're working, this basically is a risk that we're going to erase the gains that we have seen.
Yeah.
And we're going to continue perpetuating the monoculture that is the business world today.
Interesting. We're going to hear some firsthand accounts of that in our next segment. I have one more question before we go to some questions, if some of you have some questions. And also, we have a couple from already from the audience. But I want to ask you this one, which is, if there was just one thing that each of you would like the audience to remember from this conversation and from your book, what is that one thing?
So every executive wants their organization to have a learning mindset, right? We want to have a learning mindset as we take this forward. As an executive, the thing that you need to do is be willing to admit, I don't have all the answers.
Right.
I've been a CEO myself. I know that challenge. You have to balance out two things simultaneously, right? Which is I'm painting the vision, the mission, the aspiration, the goals. And at the same time, I've got to say, I can't get us there on my own.
Right.
I don't know the path fully. But doing that by opening up and saying, I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to enlist the rest of you in figuring it out. And we're going to experiment and iterate our way into a better way of working. You're inviting the rest of the organization to help you move forward. And what's really key about that is people who trust that their leaders are being transparent about their future of work plans are people who don't trust that their leaders are being transparent are 4 times more likely in our research to say that they're definitely looking for a new job. if you don't trust me, I'm not going to trust you either.
Right.
And so building that trust requires that we actually open up as executives to, I don't know all of the answers.
Right. Good one.
Yeah, Brian, you took the keyword right out of my mouth, and it's about trust. The future of
Trust.
work is about
Yeah.
not just your employees trusting you, it's trusting your employees to do what's best.
Right.
Prior to the pandemic, what we saw was that employees needed to figure out how their life fit into their work, and we've seen a shift. And now people are evaluating how their work fits into their lives.
Yes.
And it's imperative that leaders embrace flexibility. We're seeing that as like second most important thing for employees when determining job satisfaction. But in order to do so successfully, you need to trust your employees to do what's best for themselves as well as for the organization.
Yeah.
That's the only way that this is going to work.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Now I want to go to questions. I know that we have one that's already, someone's raised their hands. Lauren, are you here to ask your question?
We've been remote since the pandemic, no interruption like they were saying before. We are fully remote with an option to go in person. We have like sort of an HQ clubhouse type of thing. But what I noticed is we have a lot of really young employees. And for the people that went remote and knew what it was like to work in person, I think there's sort of a different trajectory than those coming into the workforce into a remote environment. And I really worry about those very young employees and Gen Z coming out who really haven't gotten the exposure and they're not exposed to the really senior person day to day or next to their boss hearing them either mess up or do things right and being able to sort of like learn through osmosis. I guess, what are your sort of perspectives and tips on how you can push that in the remote environment? And also, how do you kind of incentivize your leadership and management in order to make sure they're sort of responsible and feeling accountable to driving culture and figuring out when it makes sense to have meaningful in-person moments versus like arbitrary, you have to be in here X number of days a week?
So I'll take
Yeah,
the
go
first
ahead.
half, if that's okay. My half step into empty nesting is the fact that I've got a son who actually just graduated college and is entering the workforce. He does not want to be a fully remote employee. Matter of fact, very few people want to be fully remote. He wants time in the office to get to know people, to have that kind of collaboration. What we've seen work well, almost regardless, is making sure that you bring an intentional approach to how you onboard, how you apprentice, and how you mentor people. So instead of just landing somebody in, the standard onboarding process and then throwing them into an open floor plan area and hoping that they find people,
Right.
what we've all had to do over the course of the pandemic is start getting more intentional about pairing them up not only with a manager but with a mentor, preferably in another team, so they've got somebody else that they make a connection with. And I think that kind of approach, thinking through how do I pair these people up, and then as a manager of that team, with someone who's younger coming on board, think through how am I spending my time with them? Because that's really where you want to center both time together physically, as well as your one-on-ones that have to be weekly with those people, is getting them acclimated to the organization, helping them from a culture perspective, getting a deeper understanding of how the work gets done.
Yeah.
The more that you can do some of that in writing, as Raj was getting to earlier, the better. But it's bringing that intentional approach that says, this person is going to need help along the way. How am I going to engineer the process for them to get as productive as they can, but also feel that they belong in that organization?
Right.
Yeah.
Sheela,
I think a big part of this is reskilling managers. We have a step in the book about that. Traditional management training is about gatekeeping. It's about measuring activity,
Yep.
not necessarily outcomes. And a big role for the manager now is to be that coach, the one who's opening up their networks, the one who's coming in and saying, all right, let's get together for training, for mentorship, to Brian's point. And so a lot of this takes investment in terms of what's the role of your manager and how do they measure success?
Yeah.
And also ensuring that you're investing in them in terms of coaching, feedback, and celebrating what's going on.
It makes me think, there's so many tropes that are built into the language of work. Managing by walking around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How do you manage by walking around when you have a digital HQ? Right? I was so excited to see the announcement yesterday at Frontiers, which is a big conference that Slack does, that Huddles, which is a popular feature for audio, which we just started to adopt here, is expanding to video and a bunch of other stuff, screen sharing and reactions and all sorts of cool stuff. But the idea that you can just not have to schedule a Zoom.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I was always a big fan because newsrooms are newsrooms. They're rooms where people who make, who create news, are together. You walk around and you talk to people, you learn stuff, right? And like managing by walking around. But like the idea that I can just say, hey, let's quickly catch up without the rigmarole of, everyone looking at their calendars. I mean, that's so much friction.
We spent decades thinking the office was the hammer for work. The office and the 9 to 5 were how we got all things done. The challenge of the last 2 years is 30-minute video calls became the hammer.
Oh my God, yes.
Right? And what we did is if I needed 5 minutes with Sheela, what I do is I look on her calendar, schedule a 30-minute meeting a week from now.
Right.
In order to have a 5-minute conversation.
I mean, it's kind of a productivity killer, I would
And
say.
then for the next 25 minutes, we'd be like, all right, what else can we talk about? Like, how do we build a 30
You
minute?
talk about your kids.
Yeah.
You know, that's what that's about. But look, we're out of time, unfortunately. There's so much more we could have gone into. It's fascinating.
It's a lot of fun.
Follow these guys on LinkedIn. Buy their book. It's really good. I wanted to ask you what you wish you had gotten in there that you've already learned, but we'll leave that maybe for a follow-up post that I'll do later. How about that?
Yep.
Fantastic.
Brian, Sheela, thank you so much for joining us. It was really fascinating.
Thank you.
All right. Of course, as I said before, please, you've got to check that book out. But next, we're moving into where the rubber meets the road, because in actual practice, as we've already been discussing, this is not easy to do. How are companies really creating a new work environment? I mean, easier said than done, all right? But we have joining us for our final segment 2 corporate leaders who can help us understand and translate these ideas into specific practices so you can build a flexible workplace for your company. Let me introduce them as they join us virtually. This is truly a hybrid event. We are doing both in-person and virtual. Stan Joosten is a 30-plus year innovation veteran of Procter & Gamble, one of the largest and most well-known companies in the world. He leads the Signal Innovation team responsible for future-proofing P&G's renowned brand-building capabilities. His team serves as the Global Innovation Lab, focused on solving strategic business challenges. Stan's expertise and experience includes digital advertising and commerce, emerging technologies, innovation strategy, and organizational capabilities and design. He is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of P&G's Signal Thought Leadership Platform. You should check that out at pgsignal.com. And he is also the, the P&G Signal Platform includes the Signal Summit and the monthly Signal 360 publication. He is a trusted advisor to executives inside and outside of P&G, and a Dutch native married to a Brazilian who is quite excited about World Cup soccer this year. Also joining us is Ric Clark, who spent most of the last 36 years with the Brookfield Property Group, building a team and growing the real estate assets under management from approximately $5 billion when he joined to over $200 billion. During his tenure, he expanded investment, operational and asset management capabilities beyond the office sector to include multifamily, industrial, hotel, retail, and other sectors. And he also expanded Brookfield's geographic footprint from North America and Brazil to Europe, Australia, India, and China. As of June 2020, when he left to form his new firm, WatermanCLARK, Brookfield owned and managed more than 600 million feet of properties in key markets worldwide. That is a lot of office space to figure out what to do with after a pandemic. So thank you, gentlemen, both for joining me. I appreciate it. All right, Stan and Ric, you get to bring us home. We've heard summary of research and insights from Raj, the deep insights and reporting of Brian and Sheela's book, but you two, as I said earlier, are where the rubber meets the road. Let's start with a brief question for each of you. The same question. Stan, you can start. How did this pandemic change each of your company's approach to managing the workforce? Stan?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. And a lot of the previous sections resonated very, very well with me. I've seen that too. How we dealt with things, it was actually impressive from one moment to another, where we were a very office-centric company with many offices around the world, right? Suddenly we couldn't go to our offices. What do you do, right? And what stood out for me is that we focused on principles and priorities. And with 90,000 people, you can imagine that there's a lot of rules around the company that we normally have. But what management clearly came out with is like the 3 things matter in our principles here. And that is that you take care of each other, you take care of the employees that are there. And then, the consumers and customers that we serve, our business, stay focused on that. We still have a business to run. And the third one, which was very important, everybody lives in communities where there's a lot of turmoil going on around that. We are also citizens of our community, so take care of our communities as well, right? That was basically the tenet on the priorities. The other part of this was that, as I said, that we have many policies around and rules, and that went very quickly out of the window, where it was says like, do the right thing, and you can trust that we had in each other to do the right thing. Really helped us in a very agile way to navigate very quickly to a place that we could continue the business, still take care of people, right? So we became very pragmatic, and there was a lot of red tape that suddenly was cut, and we just say like, okay, we got to do this, right?
Right. Yeah. I remember talking to you at the time and being sort of astonished at how quickly that red tape got cut. I want to ask Rick the same question. How did the workplace change at Brookfield? That's where you were when the pandemic began. And I have a follow-up for you after you answer that.
Yeah, John, thanks for having me, and Stan, pleasure to be on the panel with you today. I actually was in the process of starting my new firm right as the world turned upside down. So I could probably speak, better about my new venture. And what we did is, I think, similar to Stan. We ended up making a point of sitting down with each of our tenants, finding out what their concerns were, pulling together tenant groups so that we could, benefit from best practices that each one of them were employing at the time. But, bottom line for us is we wanted to make sure we had safe environments for the employees of our tenants to return to when they wanted to. Some of the things we did, we took vacant space. We basically turned them into conference center for tenants to use for free, so that they could spread out and feel safe and comfortable, and encouraging their tenants to come back to work.
Yeah, so that leads to the next question I was going to ask you, which is, you see a lot of commercial office space, in your line of work. Has it literally physically shifted in terms of how it's been used over the past few years?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, a lot of people say that COVID sort of changed the nature of the use of office space. And the truth is, I think there was a lot of change already in the works, and all COVID really was an accelerator. And so, I think there are some changes that, were pushed into effect. And, things like architects and designers for years had been talking about abandoning this sort of man your battle station linear workspace for something that's more organic, with a lot of breakout space, focus on sort of wellness and hospitality amenities for the employees. And, a lot of this comes from the fact that millennial and Gen Z age cohort now make up over 50% of the workforce. And, they're different from the age cohorts that preceded them in the way that they work. This group was born with a smartphone in their hand. They understand technology. They can be productive working from anywhere, but they're also focused on themselves, and they're focused on, health and wellness and well-being. So, there's been a shift in renovating buildings or designing buildings that are responsive to these needs. Things like better air quality, hospitality amenities, outdoor space, and those kind of things. And, I can go into more detail if it's useful. I don't want to use up all the time. But
I want to ask you, I do, Rick, I want to ask you, because you have a couple of amazing stories that I want to get into. But before we do, the earlier conversation with Brian and Sheela sparked a question for you, Stan, because I know, I spoke with you earlier, P&G, I would say, it's fair perhaps to say that P&G was not a super flexible place when it comes to it has its policies. Those policies have protected and preserved the company for almost 200 years. But as you told me, very rapidly, P&G went to sort of a team-based approach in terms of whether or not people had to return to the office. Can you talk about that shift?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, first of all, P&G has always been a very people-centered company. One of my famous quotes, or not my famous quote, but one of the ex-CEOs from a long time back, it says, like, if you take away all the buildings and the brands and you keep the people, the company can rebuild itself. The people will rebuild the company within 10 years, right? And that has always been in the DNA of P&G to do that. And the flexibility comes from what's the work to get done, right? And who needs to do what. A one-size-fits-all approach does not fit into that. And I loved the remark that Sheela gave also, the equality and inclusion part of that. Everybody has different circumstances that they need to adapt to in the situation that is highly volatile. The word empathy comes to the forefront with that, right? And if you lead with that and you take care of the people, the rest will come, right? They will be highly supportive. You will provide a place that they feel valued, right? And value doesn't just come in financial compensation. It's also how you look at the whole human being and provide the well-being. So the flexible approaches, of course, you can't necessarily produce toilet paper from home, right? So there are some things that you need to do to make sure that production lasts. And my gosh, the real hero stories around COVID are in the plants where people, sometimes camped out overnight to make sure that things were still shipped, right? I mean, talking about like giving up something to give to your community and to consumers and customers. Now, I've been more lucky. I've always worked in some global role at P&G where you always, we didn't fly all over the planet every day, right? It's a very expensive proposition. So we had a lot of communication that already was what now has become commonplace, right? So it really is around the work to get done. How do we get the work done, right? That's very principle based. There isn't necessarily a guide that says here are the 10 things that you need to do.
Yeah, good point, Stan. Now, Rick, I want to ask you about a specific example that you told me when we spoke last week. A building that you and your team are working on now that seems to be like a very good example of what the new physical workspace might look like. Can you tell us a bit more about Lever House?
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing here at WatermanCLARK in conjunction with my old firm Brookfield is the renovation of Lever House, which is a 1950s building, very iconic, ahead of its time when it's built. But we're redeveloping it to be responsive to these wants and needs of this group that's really driving the world's economy, and so we're doing things like well, let me just back up. I'll try to do this quickly. There's a podium that has 15,000 square feet of indoor space and 15,000 square feet of outdoor space, and one of the things that we found through our research is that most people spend 85% of their day indoors between work and home. And, studies show that, they really don't get time to get up during the day and go outside. And so, but for those that do, just 20 minutes, whether you're exercising or just getting outside, makes a huge difference in your happiness as well as your productivity. So, we're creating sort of a tenant hospitality floor on the third floor where tenants can come downstairs, grab a cappuccino, take their laptops, sit outside in a great sculptured garden and do their work, and then go back in their office upstairs. We also are addressing things like air quality. A lot of the buildings in big cities were built in the 70s and 80s, and at the time, energy conservation was a big theme. So, as a result, to save energy, air was physically recirculated, throughout the building. So you could literally be breathing the air that someone 10 floors above you just exhaled. It's, kind of a disgusting thought. So we're putting a dedicated outside air system, which has multiple
You're
zones.
making me want to open a window right now, Rick.
Yeah, I know. I get to young in my career, I met with we're a public company. I met with a stock analyst, and he was telling me how in the afternoons he feels sluggish. I knew the answer why, because he's just breathing a lot of carbon dioxide. So we're putting in an air system called a dedicated outside air system that has multiple zones on a floor and brings in 100% fresh air. So you're on, any specific floor, it's all fresh air. So, this building will have 50% more fresh air than other buildings. And I think, the buildings that have been performing and leasing space throughout this pandemic, I think 70% of the leases in New York City are in the so-called better buildings that are addressing these concerns.
Yeah, that there's a market indicator of what's coming in the future of work. Stan, the truth is we still have to, deal with some boundaries, particularly a company as large as P&G. There's sort of, work from anywhere sounds great until you realize that you can't move from one country to another because there's tax implications for the company, for example. You mentioned that on our pre-call. But another was mentioned by Sheela and Brian around trust. How are you, give us a couple daily examples of how you as a manager are building that trust. What new practices have you put into effect?
Well, when you go back to trust, it comes out of relationships and having understanding and empathy and learning from each other. And once we didn't have the meeting place in the office where everybody came around, it's like, what do you do? So that was just when I got into leading this group. And the first thing I did was, let's just get together Wednesday mornings and chat and do some work, catch up with some personal stuff, understand how everybody's doing. People had some ways to cope with certain things. There was a lot of people in the group that had young kids. It actually became an attraction because our group works with lots of other people. They said, come join us on Wednesday morning, tell your story too, work-wise, personal-wise, and so on. That has lasted. And every Wednesday we still do that. And sometimes there's 10 participants, and sometimes we bring in a guest and there's 50, right? So there is a way to create these water cooler elements. And in my job, which is focused on innovation, the best connections that I always appreciate are the weaker links. And there were surprisingly few in a time that everything has to be scheduled, right? So that also has to be recreated. So that was something.
By weaker links, I think I just want to make sure that people understand. You mean people who you don't have strong connections with. You don't mean like
correct
people that are about to get fired.
The people that you don't meet on a daily basis, the people that you run into, is like, that's an interesting person. A visitor from another country just happens to be in who you have coffee with, and you learn things that you otherwise wouldn't have heard, that you couldn't possibly get out of a Zoom meeting, right? So it takes deliberate effort to do that. And some of these water cooler meetings led to some of those connections. So I didn't know you were working on that. Let me call you later, right?
Right.
And so recreating some of that is harder effort than what you do in an office, right? And so that was very important to me. The other element to mention, which the point was very important recently, there was a little bit of grumbling about like some management saying like, we need to go back to the office or so, right? So, and it wasn't, P&G had not made any declaration on that at what level, but there was a suggestion that I loved. It was from Mark Pritchard, who was my boss, our chief brand officer, who said, listen, there's a whole new generation that has joined P&G. They've never even set foot in the building, right? Our culture is important. If trust is important, culture matters. Culture consists of relationships. Make an effort, please, to a senior manager. He said, make an effort, please, to build these relationships, right? However you do it, but go get a coffee, whether it's at the Starbucks, come into the building or so, but make these people feel at home and part of the P&G family, right? And do that deliberately. And I thought it was such a poignant point that the people who've been there for a while, and obviously I've been there for a while, put out the welcome mat for people who are there and still finding their footing, right? Because you want them to be themselves and bring their whole passion to the party here and be part of the family, as I said.
Yeah. Final question for you, Ric, before we go to a couple of audience questions. And I really appreciate you telling me this story, but the pandemic exposed what you call some sort of structural imbalances in the way your former firm approached hiring and promotion. And Sheela mentioned this in our earlier conversation, the people who tend to come in every day and the proximity bias. You mentioned that that your company realized there were issues around diversity and productivity that were exposed when everyone started working from home. Can you tell that story quickly?
Yeah, I take personal responsibility for this. But one of the things that my board of directors used to ask me when I was CEO of this very large business with over 20,000 employees is how are we doing on diversity? And when you looked in the numbers and just take the woman to the male to female ratio, they were pretty good. They were 50-50. But once you got above the level of vice president, they got skewed heavily towards male. And there was kind of a reason for that, and that is we had rigid work rules in place. We insisted people be at work 5 days a week. And the reality is most women are responsible for looking after, managing the household, managing the children's lives, et cetera, in most cases. And, it was hard for them. They would have to either take a personal day or a vacation day in order to take their kids to the doctor, et cetera. And so, maybe that took up 2 hours of their day. The rest of the day was just sort of lost. And, when they could have been working. So, but the other thing I think Sheela mentioned this is just helping with, adding to the diversity, the color diversity within an organization. And just take New York City, for example, is broad as the reach of the New York City mass transit system is. There are parts of some of the boroughs where, very, talented people can't get the jobs. And so, I think this idea of a hybrid kind of work, is a very positive thing. It's kind of tough for a real estate person, particularly one invested heavily in the office sector, to say, but I think a healthy balance is actually good and will lead to better productivity.
Yeah. Well, you're here to hear first, folks. We've got a question from LinkedIn that just came in, and either of you can take it. One thing I've noticed about remote work is that interactions become more and more transactional. How do you retain authenticity of relationships while being remote?
Wow,
Stan,
that's a very good question. I just this morning I had a conversation. There's a couple of people that I reach out to on a fairly frequent basis just to see how they're doing, that you have some relationship with, and not always with an agenda, right? I had one or two questions this morning that I wanted to talk to this person about. Like, we touch base, every other month or so. But the rest was a little bit personal, a little bit what's going on around him, how he sees the world. And those are conversations that are important, because the transactional part only gives you, a small piece of what's going on. It's like, hey, can we just organize this or do that? But the broader perspective is also where the ideas come from, where I think we also find balance. Hey, I'm not the only one struggling with this, or, here's a great idea to use. That's my intent, like, to find some spots for myself on the authenticity with some people who I just stay in touch with, and basically, it's your own advisory board, but also a trusted network as a bit of a support group, right?
Yeah, good point. Final thoughts, Rick?
Yeah, I just add to that. I think remote work worked throughout the pandemic because when it hit, people understood the company that they worked for. They knew the goals of the company. They knew the people that they worked with. They knew their jobs. They knew other colleagues' jobs within the organization. So, they knew how to stay in touch with people and keep the ball moving forward. So I think, as the young people came into the organization and didn't have that knowledge or experience, it became very difficult. So it's a great question. I think, a lot of thought and energy needs to go behind, creating sort of ways for people to stay in touch and be mentored and to, basically understand and advance in their career. It's not easy. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, Rick, Stan, thank you both so much for joining us and for sort of offering that from the trenches point of view on all the topics we've been discussing. And if any of you want to connect with Rick and Stan, they suggest you do it on LinkedIn. They are active there. Thank you again, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining us. If you're on LinkedIn or on Twitter or YouTube, thank you guys for coming. We've got drinks. All of you out there on the stream, go have a drink. Send us a pic of you having a drink. Thanks to our speakers, Raj, Sheela, Brian, Stan, and Rick, and a huge thank you to our event partner, Future Forum. There's a lot of great work coming out of Future Forum. I read their quarterly pulses. You should sign up for them. And of course, get that book, How the Future Works. There it is. We want to keep that thing on the bestseller list for many, many months. I don't know about you, but I've certainly learned a lot. We're in the midst of an epic work transformation, one that's been decades in the making, but certainly accelerated in the past few years. Flexible work model seems to me to be the most effective, and we've learned the steps that companies can take to how doing it well matters. So this stream will be available for replay after this broadcast. You can watch it back, and you can and should share it with your friends and colleagues. If you like this stream, email us at events@therecount.com. We'll put you on the list. Maybe you can be one of the special people who gets to come into our office. We might double the size of the audience next time. We would love to have you join us again right here. So for now, thank you again for being part of this, and enjoy your evening.